learning more and more as far as that's concerned as information continues to trickle in. Anybody need a sheet from last week? I think everybody was here last week. All right, so tonight we are continuing to talk about the Carthaginian dynasty, empire, if you will, and we talked about that last week and kind of leading up to it, and we talked about the second Pepin, right? So we talked about the first one too, but the second Pepin is the one that's more important in that Pepin had become the first king of the Frankish Empire under the Carthaginian dynasty. Remember, the Merovingian family had been in charge. The others had been the mayors, and then the Carthaginians become the king. So Pepin had become the king. Pepin died in 768, and he had two sons, Charles and Carloman, and they both succeed him as joint rulers of the Frankish Empire. Doesn't typically work out well to have 2 or 3 or 4 of your children or generals or something to do that. In this particular case, it works out though. But I would say, in a general sense, if anybody here becomes a king or a queen, don't divide the empire, to your children. Carloman only lives for a few years as the joint ruler over France. He dies in 771, and that leaves Charles as the sole ruler. So beginning in 771, Charles begins to rule. And he reigned as the sole ruler over this Frankish Empire for 43 years. And he is the ruler of what was considered the first great Western empire since the fall of the Roman Empire. And it certainly was that. He is known as Charles the Great, or the Latin terminology for that is Charlemagne. And so that's typically how he's known in history, as Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne is I'm sure, somebody that you've heard before. I know he was mentioned when I was going through high school and that sort of thing, but I don't know that we spent more than probably 5 minutes on Charlemagne, which is a bit odd since he's one of the characters throughout history, not just church history, but history, especially Western history. One of the central figures of certainly this particular time period. And the influences that he had went hundreds, even 1,000 years into the future. So he's quite a significant figure. He was called the Moses of the Middle Ages by some. And one of the reasons he had that particular title of the Moses of the Middle Ages, it seems a little strange, but the idea was that he led the Germanic peoples out of the wilderness of being barbarians and civilized them. And he gave them a new civil code as well as different ecclesiastical laws that lasted for many years. And we'll talk about many of those laws and the civil code and that sort of thing. One of Charlemagne's biographers who served as one of his palace officials. So this is a man who knew Charlemagne personally and wrote down some descriptions. Now, I think we do have to take this with a grain of salt here. This is a guy who loved Charlemagne, who served in his palace, saw him as the great king, of that time. But this is the description that he gave. He said that he was a physical giant of a man with the strength and energy of many men. He was described as sober and simple in his private life, just and generous as a ruler, affectionate as a father. He was said to be voraciously loyal in his friendships, and he was certainly very popular with those that served under him, his subjects. He was said to have had a sharp mind and knowledgeable, although for the most part uneducated. Didn't have much formal education, but again was sharp mentally and knowledgeable in the things that he had studied. He certainly seems to have had a sincere Christian faith, although skewed by the times, as I think we'll see, and I don't think that that's anything that is different from today. Certainly he was devoted to the Catholic Church of his time, and he had at least what he felt was a personal mission from God in order to unite the Western nations under a Christian empire, and he went about doing that. Now, despite all the positives that were spoken of Charlemagne, he was not perfect. He had some certainly imperfect standards, especially when it came to sexual conduct, which is where a lot of these kings and rulers had issues. He was married and divorced several times, and after his fifth wife died, good that he didn't divorce her, he had a number of concubines that he had in his later years. And so that certainly, from a Christian aspect, that's certainly a mark against him. But we're going to look at a lot on his life. It's probably certainly going to take all of tonight and probably another time together to kind of talk about a lot of what went on with his life. And so we're going to look at it in kind of sections. We're going to talk about his military campaigns. We're going to talk about the Holy Roman Empire. We're going to talk about the cultural effects that he had at the time in which he ruled. Certainly his religious policies, and then finally some of the interactions that he had with the Pope, which are interesting as well. So let's start by looking at his military campaigns. Let's look at his military campaigns first. Charlemagne spent the majority of his reign fighting in long wars. Now, of course, that didn't mean that he was always there, or that all of his army was, in one particular place. They were spread out at various times. But as far as a warrior was concerned, he was considered to be extremely brave and an outstanding general. His armies, really during his entire reign, only suffered one defeat under his leadership. His very first campaign was against the Lombards in Italy. And this is when Pope Adrian I appealed to Charlemagne to rescue him from them. Now, we've already looked at two occasions when that happened under Pepin's reign, when the Lombards were threatening the Pope and there in Rome, and Pepin had to come down to help. Well, Charlemagne comes down. He takes care of things a little bit differently, though, than Pepin did. Charlemagne invaded Italy. He conquered the entire Lombard kingdom. He deposed their king, whose name was Desiderius, and he made himself the king of Lombardy. And so he just kind of got rid of the Lombards totally, or at least engulfed them into the Frankish Empire. A little bit later on, Charlemagne went on to fight the Muslims in Spain. And we might have expected that. I mean, obviously they're right on his kind of southern border, western a little bit, but mostly the southern border. And he pushed them back all the way as far as Barcelona in the south. He also fought in the west on the German frontier. He annexed Bavaria and defeated the pagan Avars that in what is now Hungary, so the nation of Hungary. And they were a group that, if I remember correctly, were more of Asian descent, and had come and were kind of taking over, and Charlemagne went and pushed them back and took that area. But his longest war was against the pagan Saxons. The Saxons. We've talked about the Saxons before. I remember the Angles and the Saxons had gone up into England, and they were had basically taken over much of England at this time. Well, there were still Saxons there in Germany, and most of those that were still in Germany were still pagans, and it took Charlemagne 18 campaigns over 30 years in order to finally defeat them. And what he did in order to finally overcome them was, as he beat different groups, he would take those groups and resettle them in another part of the Frankish Empire. And by doing that, they would have to kind of adapt to those that were in the other parts of the empire. Now, he's not the first one to do this. This is actually what the Assyrians were known for doing when they took over an area, which is exactly what they did when they destroyed the northern nation of Israel. They came down and destroyed Israel. They took the Israelites out and spread them all over the kingdom. That's why the 10 tribes are largely dispersed. And they're called, the missing 10 tribes and that sort of thing. Although there were people from those tribes that, still survived and that sort of thing. But that's kind of what Charlemagne does. Now, the one thing that Charlemagne does that's a little bit different is when he resettles these large groups into other parts of his empire, he compels them to choose between Christian baptism or being put to death. Which would you like to do? I remember sitting and talking with a group of Muslim men one time overseas, and they were talking about how gracious and benevolent Islam is to those that they conquer. And I said, well, they have killed a lot of people. And they said, oh, but that's their choice. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, Islam is always generous in giving you a choice. You can either convert to Islam or you can die. And I said, well, I'm not going to argue with you too much, but I don't think that's much of a choice going on there. Well, you see that in Christian life as well, in Christendom, that took place too. So in Charlemagne's empire, that did happen for a time. But even, and I think this is interesting, even during Charlemagne's time, there were people who protested the fact that people were being forced into Christianity, which is good. We talk about, especially in this time, a lot of what had gone wrong with the church, but this is what went right. I mean, there were some people who still understood that the gospel didn't need to be forced on people. In fact, one of Charlemagne's chief religious advisors, who we'll talk about a lot, who's named Alcuin, Alcuin of York, he says this, and obviously this is an English translation: faith is a free act of the will, not a forced act. We must appeal to the conscience, not compel it by violence. You can force people to be baptized, but you cannot force them to believe. Now, I think that's exactly what we would say today if there were people who tried to force people to believe. So that's certainly a good statement. Eventually, in 797, so this is, 20 years after Charlemagne has been king, he does abolish the death penalty for paganism. So you can be a pagan within the Frankish Empire and not be executed because of it. Now that was pretty brief on his military campaigns, but obviously that's not our focus here. So, but I do want you to see that that did have influence, and it does have influence as far as Christianity is concerned, because when he did go into places, he did try to promote Christianity there. Obviously, in some bad ways, there are some good ways as well. Now let's talk about the Holy Roman Empire. Now remember that the Western Roman Empire had fallen back in 476. 476. So by the time Charlemagne comes along, the Western Roman Empire had been gone for 300 years. Now that's a long time. That's longer than the United States has been around. So I know when we're talking about these time periods, sometimes we'll jump 200 years, but just think about the span of time there. The Western Roman Empire had been gone for a while, but many saw Charlemagne's kingdom as something of a recreation of that old Roman Empire, and all that kind of came to a head and came to great significance because of one particular event. On Christmas Day, in the year 800. Christmas Day in the year 800. Now this makes it very easy to remember. It's good round numbers, 800. Okay? It's not 803, not 797, 800. Charlemagne was kneeling at the altar of St. Peter's Church in Rome, and he was receiving communion, as was a fairly normal practice. And at the time, he was surrounded by Frankish nobility as well as Roman clergy. And Pope Leo III suddenly produces a crown. He produces a crown, and he places it on Charlemagne's head, while his subordinates, that's the other clergy there, shout, "To Caesar Augustus, crowned by God, great and peacemaking Emperor of the Romans, long life and victory." And this particular act on Christmas Day of 800 is the beginning of what became known as the Holy Roman Empire. Now, what's the significance of the Holy Roman Empire? Well, just for starters, the Holy Roman Empire was not dissolved until 1806. 1806, during the wars with Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars. So it lasted over 1,000 years. Now, not necessarily in the same form, not necessarily even with one ruler over it. There's various forms, but the Holy Roman Empire was still around. In fact, it's because of the Holy Roman Empire was basically where Martin Luther lived within Germany during the Reformation. So when we get there, we're going to talk about the Holy Roman Empire. So it's going to become a part of things. The meaning of that particular event was not supposed to be just that Charlemagne was the king of the Franks. That really was already something that was established. But it really symbolized the fact that he was the heir of the Western Roman Empire and the supreme ruler of it. So he was looked at as something of like a new Constantine, a new emperor to the Roman Empire. And that was certainly something that was significant. And he was really seen by most of the people at that time in that particular way. Now, as you can imagine, the emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, which was still in existence and continuing forward, were resentful of this idea, since they saw themselves as the true heirs of the Roman Empire. After all, they were where the Roman Empire was. They had continued on even in that 300-year period. The Eastern Roman Empire still functioning. They still had an Eastern emperor that was over the Byzantine Empire. So for Charlemagne to come along and to say that he was the heir of the Roman Empire, well, that didn't, it just didn't sit well. And it further drove the two empires apart, which we've already begun to see that division, taking place in multiple different ways. This particular act of the Pope crowning Charlemagne as the and beginning this Holy Roman Empire was an act that signified that the Holy Roman Emperor owed his position to the papacy and was therefore under the authority of the Pope. Now, we had talked about this with Pepin, because remember, Pepin was crowned by the Pope as well. And obviously the popes would have thought that they had control over Charlemagne. As we're going to see, that wasn't necessarily the case. And we'll see why in the future. Charlemagne certainly was pleased by the action of the Pope in naming him the emperor of this Holy Roman Empire, but he wasn't necessarily pleased in how Leo III had done it, because of this fact that it made people think that he then owed something to the Pope. Now that's probably why Leo III did it, right? Because if you do that, I mean, it's all power plays, and you did have that back and forth. But there really wasn't anything that Charlemagne could do about it. It was done, and it was done in the way that it was done. And again, we'll talk about the relationship between Charlemagne and the Pope in a little while.
Now this, you said, lasted 1,000 years. So was it Charlemagne's bloodline continued?
No, it did not. Actually, a pretty short bloodline. So we'll kind of see how that, when we get through Charlemagne, and we'll talk briefly about that. But no, it doesn't last very long at all. His son is, takes over, but he has all the power, but none of the abilities. And then he comes along, and I think he divided the kingdom among his 4 sons, I think it was, which I told you that doesn't work well, and it kind of fell apart after that.
It was interesting, on our trip to Germany last year, we spent a week in Bavaria, and it's still strong Roman Catholic influence there. But you go up north towards Wittenberg, not so much.
Right.
And so in all those years, it had a lasting influence.
I'm sure.
Churches or cathedrals are all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's still many monasteries that are there in the different areas, and which is, again, it makes the Reformation even more significant when you think about the hold that the Catholic Church did have in Germany, and it's a German monk of all people who starts that. And I'd just say he was the big influencer, but the Reformation had kind of started even before then, but he was the one who kind of steamrolled it. So, but yeah, still a tremendous influence there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about culture. Charlemagne had certainly a tremendous influence on the culture of the time. He sought to produce a flourishing Christian culture. A flourishing Christian culture.
There's another sheet that we might be missing. No.
Yeah, I don't have that yet, so just
Okay.
listen. There's been a lot going on this week, so.
I just thought I was out.
Now, this became known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Carolingian Renaissance. And I'll give you notes on some of this as we move forward too. But the Carolingian Renaissance. And again, while Charlemagne wasn't educated himself, he certainly sought to bring education to the people of the empire. And so he gathered some of the most distinguished scholars of Western Europe at the time. And most of these were monks, because monasteries were really the centers for learning and culture at the time. That really should have been churches, but again, we talked about how the influence of monasteries. And among some of these guys that were influential were a man named Paul the Deacon, Paulinus of Aquileia, and Theodulf of Orleans. And again, you don't have to spell those out. I'll give you notes on them. But those were three guys. Paul the Deacon was a Lombard, so he was from kind of the south in the area of Italy. And he was known for writing a collection of sermons for the festivals and saints' days of the church, which were used for the next 1,000 years. Again, that's pretty significant if people are reading your sermons 1,000 years from the time that you preach them or write them.
So were they doing like every year go through the same sermons?
Yeah, pretty much for different days. And so you would have various sermons or homilies, as they later were known, which were kind of shorter sermons that would be done on these various days. Now again, one of the things that you see different here is the feast days and the saints' days. So as compared to early on in Christianity, you didn't have those, because again, the focus was on Christ. So it's not until later on that you see the feast days, which are more of an influence because of tradition. So you see these traditional feast days beginning to come in, and of course you have they see them in the Old Testament. And there's nothing wrong with having days that you celebrate. I mean, we have days that we celebrate. But when they come with the authority that they did with the church, then you have some issues. I don't have so much of a problem with the feast days as I do with the saints' days. And obviously that's when you begin to have more of the saints and their influence and the veneration that begins to come with them. Paulinus of Aquileia was also a Lombard, and he was supposed to have been an outstanding bishop in northeastern Italy. And he was a writer of hymns, poems, letters, and he had a number of writings that were written against the adoptionist heresy, which we'll talk about. We're not there yet, but he wrote against that, and so he had a tremendous amount of writing. And Theodulf of Orleans was a Gothic Spaniard who became the Bishop of Orleans in north central France. And he too wrote against the adoptionist heresy, and he's known for some of his writings in that. And he was in favor of some other things, also a hymn writer, but he was influential. But of all of those, there's one that stands out by far in the Frankish Empire, and certainly during the time of Charlemagne. And that is a guy that I mentioned earlier, whose name was Alcuin of York. Alcuin of York. And he is extremely influential. He was born near the city of York in modern day England. So he was English. Now, I don't exactly know, well, I mean, I know a little bit of how he got there, but there was some English influence in the Frankish Empire, and Alcuin being probably one of the most prominent of those. But it's interesting because the Frankish Empire did not hold England. So those people had to come down from England and into the Frankish Empire in order to be a part of it. And obviously, you know, there wasn't necessarily good relations between the English and the Franks at that time. Never really has been, you know, super, well, I mean, you know, they're great friends until they're not. So you know how that kind of works. But he was the head of the cathedral school in York before he entered the service of Charlemagne in 782. And so this was, you know, again, he's becomes the sole ruler in, was it 771, something like that? So about 10 years after Charlemagne. And then for 22 years, he was the grand schoolmaster of the Frankish Empire, which, you know, meant that he was kind of in charge of all the education throughout the empire. He was a Bible commentator, so he wrote about the Bible, helping people to understand it. He was a textual scholar, so he knew about different manuscripts and different things about that. We'll talk about some of the influence there. He was a liturgical reviser, which, going back to the liturgies, which is different scriptures and sermons that were preached at various times. He revised some of those liturgies of the time. He's certainly known as a defender of orthodoxy, and we'll see that in the adoptionist controversy as one of the major ones. He was a reformer of monasteries, a builder of libraries. Jennifer would like them. She loves libraries. And also, just to throw on top of everything else, he was an astronomer. I guess he did that at night when he wasn't doing all the other things. So some of his notable influences. Alcuin reformed the spelling of the time and developed a new style of handwriting called Carolingian minuscule script. Minuscule script had been around for a time in, and this has something to do with today as well as in the past. When like biblical manuscripts are written, they are in uncial script, which means that all the letters we would call capital letters. There were no such things as lowercase letters. Minuscule letters come later, which are lowercase letters. So you begin to have both uppercase and lowercase letters. And you had various scripts that came along, and Alcuin had formed this Carolingian minuscule script, which you may even find, you know, it's like Times New Roman. It's a way of writing the letters. And what's interesting about it is that it is a direct ancestor of the scripts that we use today in the English language. So the way that we write our letters today, a part of that lineage came through the Carolingian minuscule script. So, in other words, we write today, at least to some extent, because of Alcuin. At the time, Latin was still a language that was used in Italy, obviously. But Alcuin helped to make it, and a lot of it was because of this Carolingian minuscule script, made it made Latin the international language in Western civilizations. So while they normally spoke their native tongue wherever you were, Latin, at least for educated people, became the international language. Kind of like English is today. You know, when you go to Laos, you'll still find people who speak English, especially if they do a lot of business and that sort of thing. So it doesn't matter where you go. But that certainly became the case with Latin at the time. Now again, that has influence because that goes on for a while. Latin was still kind of the international language for a long time after that. Alcuin also had great influence on the literary culture at the time, in that he had an army of monks who copied a lot of ancient documents, mostly ancient Greek and Roman texts. So a lot of the copies that we have today of ancient Greek and ancient Roman writings, we have today because Alcuin got his monks to take the manuscripts that they had and copy them. So, various writings were done by his monks. So we know a lot of those because of, again, Alcuin's work. He also established a lot of monastic libraries throughout the empire. Obviously, if you've got a lot of monks who are taking these books and they're translating them, you gotta have a place to put those books. So they're translating them and they're putting them in various libraries. And again, if you want people to be educated, then you're gonna have those for people to go and to read and to learn from. And so all of that helped to preserve and to transmit knowledge from the past, but also even up to our present time. So we know a lot of those because of those translations. Third, Alcuin revised the text of the Latin Bible. And he did that by establishing a standard edition of Jerome's Latin Vulgate. Remember back in the 400s when we were talking about Jerome. Jerome was that kind of persnickety, irritable scholar to some extent that had trouble getting along with a lot of people. Couldn't really hold his tongue very well. But one of the things he did was he translated the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament into Latin. And actually I guess it was the Greek Old Testament too, it was the Septuagint. But anyway, he takes it all and he puts it into a Latin translation. Well, by this time, and you're talking about 300 plus years later, there had been various versions done of the Vulgate. Just like we have various versions done, updates and things like that take place. But he establishes kind of a standard edition of that can be distributed throughout the Frankish Empire, which is significant. And then finally, Alcuin became Charlemagne's chief advisor to help him spread this education throughout the empire. Again, as I said earlier, Charlemagne had a tremendous desire for people to be educated. He actually ordered bishops and monks to set up schools for training other bishops and monks. So they're kind of like seminary training. He also decreed that every parish should have a school to educate male children. So basically kind of a public school system of the time. And then he founded a royal academy at Aachen, where Alcuin encouraged the study of logic and philosophy and literature and things like that. It was kind of like a central university, if you can think of it in that way. So Alcuin was very, very influential during Charlemagne's reign, and again, the things that he did had influence even on our day today. And we'll see him even more as we go through and talk about various things that happened in Charlemagne's empire. Any questions or thoughts on any of that?
Our translation of the Bible today came from the Latin, from the Hebrew and the Greek, right?
Correct.
Not from the Vulgate.
Yes and
Not
no.
from the Latin.
Correct. The answer to that is yes and no. The King James Version was largely taken from the Latin. And that's why it's a version and not a translation, is because it was, and it had influence from earlier English versions as well. But then the Greek Textus Receptus also had influence in that. But all of them were kind of used to put it together, but the main text was the Latin Vulgate. So now that doesn't make the King James text a bad text. I mean, it's obviously a good version. But I would also say, and I may get in trouble for saying this, I would also say is one of the reasons why I would, not the major reason, but a reason why I would discourage people from using the King James is because what we know of the manuscripts is significantly more now than it was in Charlemagne's time.
So much more study has been done.
So much more study, but the majority of the manuscripts that we have, especially of the New Testament, and as I guess you could say with the Old Testament as well, have come really since the 18th and the 19th centuries. Now, it's not that they were necessarily hidden. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden. That's another thing. As far as the New Testament manuscripts are concerned, they were in various places, but they may be in the mountains in the Sinai Peninsula, in a monastery there. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. I mean, one of the Codex Sinaiticus, which is one of the very good text of the Bible that we have, was discovered, I think, in the 1800s because a guy went to the monastery and he wanted to look and see what old text that they had, and he started looking at some of the old manuscripts of the Bible that they had, and they said something to the effect of, oh, well, they had a lot older text down in the basement. And so they went down to look in the basement, and you had this text from I think it's from the 4th century, so the 300s, that was down there in the basement. And it wasn't lost. I mean, the monks that were there, they knew about it.
They just didn't realize a lot of other people would like to have it.
Correct, yeah. I mean, they just didn't think anything about it. And in fact, they didn't use that. That was an old text. Why would you use it, go pull out that old book when you've got new ones that we've, have been translated since then?
So what versions are the most accurate?
Well, that's another question too. I think that most of your modern versions are pretty good as far as the texts are concerned. I would always look for a translation that was done by a translation committee and not an individual or a small group, because you've got a lot of different influence that's there. And most of your modern translations are going to be done by committee. But then you also have a disagreement on how a text should be done or how a translation should be done. And so that's going to influence how you look at a translation today. Are you looking to be as much word for word as possible? Or are you trying to look at meaning? Is meaning more important?
No matter which words you use to get it.
Correct. So, I usually give, this is just an example, but and y'all may have heard me use this before, but, tetelestai, it is finished, what Jesus said on the cross. Okay, so if you're gonna go translate that into English, because remember, there's not just like one Greek word and one English word that translates it. So in its wording, it's one word, but it means it is finished, which is how it's translated in our text. But there's more meaning in the word than can be expressed in the English translations, because the tense of the verb in the Greek word is perfect. And perfect tense of the Greek verb means that an action has occurred in the past and its influence continues forever. Now, there's nothing in English that's anywhere close to that. It's kind of a strange thing that's significant in Greek. So the question is how do you translate that? You could translate it is finished, and that would be an adequate translation. I mean, that would be word for word. But if you want to try to get across the meaning of the verb, and again, this is where you have disagreement, because somebody would say, well, there's not extra words that are there. It just says it is finished. And then somebody else would say, yes, but there are needed extra words there in order to get across the meaning. Because the meaning could be, it is finished now and forever, because of the perfect tense. Now and forever are not in the Greek text, but certainly the meaning is there in the Greek text. So how do you translate that? Well, you have different sides, and they go back and forth. So you have instances, a lot of instances like that, which are you just looking for the words, or are you looking for meaning? And so you're going to have a version like the ESV or the NASB that is going to be more word for word. And then you're going to have others that are somewhere in, well, the other side of that would be, the way other side of that would be a paraphrase. You're just kind of looking for meaning, but that's, usually that's way too far.
The Living Bible.
Yeah, something like that. But I wouldn't recommend, that side. Usually you have something like the NIV is somewhere in the middle, which tries to stick with the words, but where there needs to be meaning expressed, they'll express that meaning. And then you have like the CSB, which is kind of the Southern Baptist version. It's a little bit more literal, and I don't like to use that terminology, but a little bit more word for word, and not as much meaning given. But you understand that there's meaning given in every single one of them. I mean, the ESV will give you certain things that will give meaning, but sometimes it's clunky because they're not as interested in meaning and more interested in just kind of word for word. NASB tends to be like that to some extent. So, I mean, I would just say, as far as which translations are the best, I would just say your modern translations are going to have more textual evidence that they can use in order to put together a text. And they go back to look at all the manuscripts, where King James only had a very small group of manuscripts that they could look at. Again, doesn't make it a bad translation. It's a good translation, but there's not as much evidence that can give support to it. There's more evidence there. And again, look for multiple translators or translation committee, and then you can choose whether you want to go. And I use multiple versions, so I mean, I don't wanna say one's better than the other, I use multiple ones. There's more to it than that, but that's the gist of it. I know you were wanting me to say one, and then you could argue with me, but,
We already heard you say what
No,
you
no.
said, Laura.
No, I don't wanna argue about it.
no, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, so yeah, I mean, I've always encouraged people to look to use different ones. The King James is actually very good in the Old Testament. It's better in the Old Testament than New Testament, for whatever reason, but,
Yeah, I actually came across, said a letter that came to the original King James, where they were saying why they did this, and it was, they were trying to do, in a language of how people spoke of that day, and they were saying that it was important, to do that, which also would say even more modern translations would.
Yeah.
They would be for it because for people to understand what was being said.
Absolutely, and that was one of the purposes. Unfortunately, the King James missed on that, because in their translation process, they tried to be, most of the language that they used, actually, because they were trying to write it at a high level, was already passed by that time anyway. So it was kind of maybe the high level, old school way of speaking, but it didn't accomplish the goal necessarily of being the average, speaking of the time. But that was certainly the goal. And yes, those who translated it, I think, would be in favor of modern translations, just because the scriptures have always been, the whole purpose of them was to be understood in the language of the people. And that's the way translations have been done from the very beginning, whether it was in Syriac or, Aramaic or Latin or whatever. It was supposed to be in the language of the people. And so, yeah. And I think that's probably the biggest reason to not use the King James. Again, I don't, if people like it and they grew up with it and they memorized from it, use it. But
I mean, it was good enough for the Apostle Paul.
yeah. But when people come and ask me, I mean, that's what I'll tell them. I'll typically say pick a modern version, not the New World Translation. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, just thank you for this time together. Pray that you would bless us as we go, and Lord, help us to be the witnesses that we need to be. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay, sure.
I have the speed limit.
Go speed limit, you're over.
All those around.